You might recall a consecration to the Lord as a basic element in regard to priestly celibacy. So let us pray. I love you, O my God. My only desire is to love you until the last breath of my life. I love you, O infinitely lovable God, and I prefer to die loving you rather than to live for an instant without you. I love you, O my God, and I desire only to go to heaven to have the happiness of loving you perfectly. I love you, O my God, and my only fear is to go to hell, because one will never have the sweet solace of loving you there. O my God, if my tongue cannot say at all times that I love you, at least I want my heart to repeat it to you as many times as I breathe. Ah, do me the grace to suffer while loving you, to love you while suffering. And that when I die, I not only will to love you, but experience it in my heart. I beg you that the closer I come to my final end, you will increase and perfect my love for you. Amen. This evening we are indeed privileged to have with us Father Daniel Callam, who is a member of the Congregation of St. Basil, an associate professor of theology here within the department, and currently serving as university chaplain. Father Callam did his undergraduate work at the University of Toronto, attaining there a BA and a Bachelor of Sacred Theology. He went on to do his master's work at the University of St. Michael's and Wayne State University, and completing his studies with the doctorate in philosophy at Oxford University. Father Callam is well known here on campus for his homilies which he delivers on Sunday evenings. He likewise has become a regular speaker at the Fullness of Truth Conference, and perhaps you have also known him as an apologist within the Houston area. Father Callam's area of expertise has been historical theology, but he certainly extends himself in many other areas including systematics. Father Callam is very comfortable with this topic this evening because he draws it from his dissertation, and that is very specifically the topic of priestly celibacy. So let's give Father Callam a warm welcome this evening.
Thank you, Sister. There was a lively debate about clerical celibacy between two Catholic scholars in 19th century Germany. In 1878, Gustav Bickel published an article in Zeitschrift für katholische Theologie, which is the Journal for Catholic Theology. It is entitled Der Celibat eine apostolische Anordnung, which means celibacy, an apostolic prescription. It was answered the following year in the Theologische Quartalschrift, that's the Theological Quarterly, by Franz Xaver Funk. His title was Der Celibat keine apostolische Anordnung, which means the celibacy not an apostolic prescription. Bickel immediately responded with Der Celibat dennoch eine apostolische Anordnung, which means celibacy, nevertheless, it is an apostolic prescription. But Funk won the day with the final article in the series, Der Celibat nach lange keine apostolische Anordnung, which means the celibacy in no way an apostolic prescription. Now, strictly speaking, it's not celibacy at all, it's continence. Clerical marriage was forbidden. That means once you were ordained, you could never marry. So that an unmarried man at ordination was by that very fact bound to celibacy. The point at issue was whether a married man who accepted ordination would have to live with his wife as brother and sister in a continent marriage. And Bickel claimed yes, and the ordinance went back to the apostles, to the New Testament era. And Funk said no. He was a Catholic. He recognized its validity and value, but he claimed that it came much later, the late 4th century. Just let me summarize in a few words each of the positions. Bickel in favor of the notion that celibacy is apostolic, celibacy and continence, of course, and Funk that it isn't. So Bickel's claim, therefore, was that married men were obliged to live in absolute continence with their wives, that is, to live as brother and sister, from the time of their ordination. Bickel stressed that the earliest legislation explicitly imposing continence on married men at the time of their ordination, it dated from the 4th century, described the law as apostolic. In other words, when the church got around to legislating on the matter, it claimed in the 4th century that its legislation was merely honoring an apostolic prescription. I've got a couple of examples here to show Bickel's evidence. The first is from a decretal, a papal statement by Pope Siricius, who was pontificate lasted from 384 to 399. A letter had been sent from Spain to his predecessor, Pope Damasus, asking a long series of decisions on all sorts of questions, including clerical celibacy or continence. Damasus had died by the time the letter arrived in Rome, and therefore Pope Siricius answered it with a decretal, an authoritative Roman statement called Cum in Unum, dated 385. It's the first papal decretal imposing continence on all married clergymen. Though I might mention in passing that 80 years earlier, that is around the year 305, in Spain, a local council at Elvira had imposed or expected continence from all major clerics, that's deacons, priests, and bishops. But here's what Siricius wrote, and I wish to call your attention to the fact that he invokes the apostolic era. Quote, "When one does not observe what has been the object of useful warnings, the apostolic commandment is held in contempt and ignored." The apostolic commandment or rule. Here is what has been cited, first of all, with regard to bishops, priests, and deacons. Those who have the responsibility of the divine sacrifice and whose hands give the grace of baptism and consecrate the body of Christ are ordered by divine scripture, not only by ourselves, to be very chaste. The fathers themselves, the fathers meaning the earlier bishops, the fathers themselves had ordered them to observe bodily continence. So bodily continence for priests, deacons, and bishops is considered an apostolic commandment. Just one more example of several. This comes from a council of Carthage in the year 390, about the same time, in other words. And here's a very strong statement, one we're going to meet in different guise later on in my talk. And here's what the bishops in Carthage, in Africa, had to say. What the apostles taught, there it is again, what the apostles taught, and what antiquity itself observed. So it's not only the apostles, it's the whole tradition of the church. What the apostles taught and what antiquity itself observed, let us also endeavor to keep, namely, that the holy bishops and priests of God, as well as the Levites, that is the deacons, those who are in the service of the divine sacraments, must observe perfect continence, so that they may obtain in all simplicity what they are asking from God. Bickel quoted in his support many classical Catholic authors from the 16th century to his own day, whose names the scholars among you will probably recognize: Thomasin, Baronius, Bellarmine, Binius, Muratori, and so on. Now that's not the only thing that Bickel said, but that was the major focus of his article. Funk's reply also quotes a number of scholars. Scholars like to do that, don't they? Muster their forces for the attack. But he refutes Bickel's fundamental claim by noting that in the 4th century, any tradition was called apostolic. The idea was, if we're doing it, it must go back to the apostles. Right. Well, there's a serious difficulty with this particular observation on the part of Funk. He doesn't recognize it, and neither do most scholars, including myself when I wrote my thesis, as a matter of fact. It's the idea that if there was a tradition of some sort at the end of the 4th century, how old would it have to be before they started calling it apostolic? In other words, it couldn't have been something brand new. I don't think even Pope Siricius would have the nerve to say a novelty was apostolic. So it must have been around for a while. But how long? The point is, when you go back into the history, you find no point in history where this legislation was invoked. It's like someone who favors late-term abortions, trying to discover the point in the pregnancy where human life begins. There isn't any such point. Similarly here, there's no indication in history of a point at which all clerics were obliged either to celibacy or continence in the way that we find in the late 4th century. So if they say, in other words, that it's an apostolic tradition, we have no starting point for it unless we can go back to the apostles themselves. Scholars who favor Funk's thesis generally ignore this point. In other words, that there was already a tradition at the end of the 4th century. Therefore, the scholar should ask, how old is that tradition? But scholars normally ignore that point, simply assuming that these laws were the first to make obligatory continence or celibacy. In other words, even though they recognize that in the late 4th century they talked about a tradition, everybody seems to presume that there was no tradition, that it was a novelty, which goes against the evidence. So that's a difficulty with Funk's point. What is universally witnessed to, incidentally, throughout the ages, is an absolute ban on marriage after ordination. And I'm going to come back to that point. Funk also examined the admittedly sparse evidence, pro and con, from the first centuries. And in looking at it, he found many married clergymen with children. Actually, there's a book on the table over here by Christian Cocchini called The Apostolic Origin of Celibacy. And he lists all the known cases of bishops, priests, and deacons throughout all Christendom for the first 7 centuries that were known to be married and have children. There are 227 of them, he tells us in the book, including, incidentally, the father of St. Basil's friend and companion, Gregory of Nazianzen. So Funk had a lot of ammunition. There are hundreds that we know about, and therefore presumably many, many more we don't know about, clergymen who were married and had children. Of course, what is not known is whether any of their children were born after ordination, since we're not talking about celibacy absolutely, but married men who are bound to continence at the time of ordination. The natural supposition, I suppose, is that without evidence to the contrary, these clerics would have been in a normal marriage. Strong evidence that such was the case, in other words, that the married men who were ordained were allowed to exercise their marital rights. Strong evidence that such was the case comes from a famous episode during the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. The intervention of a monk bishop from Egypt whose name was Paphnutius. An account of that event is found in the ecclesiastical history of the 5th century historian Socrates Scholasticus, not the famous Socrates then. This would be written then in the early 5th century. His history ends with the year 439. He died around the year 450. Here's what Socrates Scholasticus tells us about Paphnutius, at the Council of Nicaea in 325. It seemed fit, he says, to the bishops at Nicaea to introduce a new law. There's the crucial word. To introduce a new law into the church, namely, that those who were in holy orders, I speak of bishops, priests, and deacons, should have no conjugal relations with their wives whom they had married while still laymen. You see, this is exactly the situation, isn't it? There's no marriage after ordination, but a married man could be ordained, and a novelty was introduced, or thought to be introduced, during the council. Someone suggested that all such clergymen should be bound to continence. And Paphnutius, the monk bishop from Egypt, who's supposed to have borne the wounds of persecution that had stopped only 12 years earlier, Paphnutius stood before the assembly and urged them before God that they ought not to injure the church by too stringent restrictions. For all men, said he, cannot bear the practice of rigid continence. The whole assembly of the clergy assented to the reasoning of Paphnutius, whereby they silenced all future debate on the point. That seems to clinch the argument, doesn't it? Paphnutius therefore stopped the Council of Nicaea from introducing a novelty in the year 325, namely that the clergy should be continent if they were married. Of course, the celibate was taken for granted. Funk produced as well instances from the primitive church of clergy being married and having children. Now, of course, the most famous instance that the Protestants like to quote over and over again, as I can tell you, is from St. Paul. Now, a bishop must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. If a man does not know how to manage his own household, how can he care for God's church? So the bishop must be the husband of one wife. He must manage his household, keeping the children submissive and respectful. And similarly, let deacons be the husbands of one wife, and let them manage their children and their households well. Both of these come from the first letter to Timothy. So just let me summarize, therefore, briefly what I've said. Beckel, who claims that the continence we're concerned with is apostolic, and Funk, who thinks it isn't. Here's what Beckel would say. An obligation of married priests and deacons and bishops to continence, and of the unmarried to celibacy, which is found in both the Greek and Latin churches of antiquity, dates back to the apostles. In Spain, it passed into law in the early 4th century at the Council of Elvira that I mentioned. The practice was confirmed for the entire church by the popes and councils late in the 4th century. Funk's position would be something like this. Celibacy, or consecrated virginity, was regarded as a high ideal, especially in the form of dedicated virginity or widowhood. We find this in the New Testament. Hence, it was held to be highly fitting for the clergy, following biblical texts such as Matthew 19:12, quote, "There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who is able to receive this, let him receive it." And also 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where St. Paul says, "I wish that all men were as I myself am. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided." Funk goes on to claim then, in fact, many Christians in the early church remained unmarried, just as many clerics embraced continence after their ordination. But not all did, or were required to do so. Continence, or celibacy as the case may be, was imposed on clerics only in the late 4th century, and then only in the Latin church, not the Greek. And then he would witness by quoting the first legislation, which comes, as I've indicated, from the late 4th century, the Council of Carthage and the papal decretals. Now, Funk's theory was so widely accepted that the issue seemed closed. And scholars turned their question to the obvious, attention to the obvious question, why was continence suddenly imposed on clerics in the Latin Church at the end of the 4th century? Two answers were advanced, one based in the widespread enthusiasm for a novelty of the 4th century, monasticism, and the other on the widespread observance of ritual purity. In other words, that before receiving the sacraments or celebrating the sacraments, a married man would have to abstain from sexual intercourse with his wife. Let me say a word about monasticism, which was the line I took when I did my thesis so many years ago, swallowing Funk's approach wholeheartedly. Simply put, the monks, in a sense, were competition for the ordained clergy. The monks were holy. They were highly respected. They were resorted to by the lay people. To keep face, to keep a position in the church, the clergy had to match the sanctity, the holiness of the monks. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so effective. Something of that continues today among the diocesan clergy. They say the divine office, which is monastic in origin. They wear sober clothing. At least in theory, they lead a simple lifestyle. And when I entered the seminary, we received the tonsure, which was the monastic haircut. Thank heavens, in a modified form. They didn't shave our heads. The strong point of this theory about monasticism, it accounts for the different discipline in the Latin or the Western Church and the Greek or Eastern Church. You know, as everybody knows, the Greek Church ordains married men, at least to the priesthood. The point is that monasticism entered the church starting in the 3rd century as an organized movement, and it moved to the West only in the 4th century. But when it came to the West, unlike the East, when it came to the West, it was sponsored by the bishops, which meant, therefore, that monasticism was incorporated into the life of the diocese, of the region, of the parishes. I've got a list here of some of the famous bishops of the 4th century and early 5th century who were either patrons of asceticism, monasticism, or monks themselves. It's an altogether impressive list. Ambrose of Milan, who died in the year 397. Eusebius of Vercelli, not exactly a household name, but a famous man at the time. Vercelli's in northern Italy. He died in 371. The famous Martin of Tours, the Apostle of France, who also died in the year 397. Chromatius of Aquileia. Aquileia is at the head of the Adriatic Sea, not very far from Venice. I went there once. Had an interesting adventure there that is irrelevant to my topic. He died in the year 407. And his household was organized as a monastery. Among those who were influenced by Chromatius was none other than St. Jerome, who learned from Chromatius the ideal of the monastic life, even if he didn't always live up to it. I don't have to mention the most famous of all, Augustine of Hippo, who died in the year 430, and made a condition of his ordination that he be allowed to continue as a monk. Another one, Apollinus of Nola, who was actually in a continent marriage and then became a bishop, but kept the monastic way of life. You can see then that priests should be more and more taken from the ranks of the monks. If the bishop is a monk and has a monastery in his household, then when there are priests or other bishops needed in the district, they would obviously come from that seedbed, that seminarium, to use the Latin term, from that seminary. And of course, they would be obliged to celibacy as being monks. Augustine's monastery in Africa, for example, we know provided clergy for the district around Hippo. Now this was my argument in my thesis. I had a difficulty, however, several difficulties. The major difficulty was the relatively short period between the arrival of monasticism in the West, it's taking over like wildfire, it's becoming popular, and the imposition of the law of celibacy in the late 4th century. When Athanasius was exiled from Alexandria in Egypt and went to Rome in the year 339, he brought with him 2 exotic animals from the Egyptian desert, 2 monks. And they created a sensation in Rome. People flocked the streets to see them the way we would go out to see a football parade or something like that. Monks. And people became extremely enthusiastic. One of Jerome's claims was that he knew all about monasticism. Jerome was the sort of person who knew everything about everything. And when he came to Rome in the year 382, he was able to satisfy the eager desire that many of the society women had to lead a monastic life. And they changed their palaces into convents, austere convents. And remarkable women, Marcella of Rome, Paula, who was Jerome's patron. Marcellina was there, the sister of St. Ambrose, who used to lecture him from time to time, and so on. I might mention an interesting comment that Marcella made. She was a young woman when she first married. Her husband died, and she was left a wealthy widow, which was the ideal position for a woman to be in ancient Rome because she controlled her money. People, of course, thought that she would marry, and they found a doddering old man that was very wealthy. And they thought he would be a wonderful second husband for her because he would make her even richer than she was, and he would die pretty soon. And her comment was, if I get married a second time, I'm going to marry a man, not a corpse. So that's the stuff they were made of. They even learned Hebrew in order to recite the Psalms in Hebrew in their palace monasteries. But it all happened too quickly. I wanted a law of universal celibacy to be imposed upon the church based on this monastic competition, if I may use the term, but it all had to happen within 40 years. And that seems a rather short time for monasticism to take over the entire Western Church and lead to this rather complicated development that I've described here. Another difficulty is related to the first. Monasticism was not universal in the West. Not everybody was a monk or honored monks. And although many bishops were ascetic, and even monks in their own practice, not all were. So there were difficulties with my thesis, which I glossed over and managed to fog by the examiners, so I got my doctorate anyway. But if I was right, that business of the bishops sponsoring the monasteries was crucially important, because it meant that a monastic tone, a monastic ideal, was incorporated into the clergy by that fact. Whereas in the Eastern Church, the monks tended to be apart, and they were not ordained. They were along the waste of the Egyptian desert, for example, just on the border of the fertile strip along the Nile. They tended to be apart from the church and really, in a way, set up almost a second institution. Those of you know who Pseudo-Dionysius is might read his writings with that in mind. That his point is to put the monks in their place and not let them obtrude into the sanctuary, which is the domain of the priest. Anyway, that's what I came up with. Monasticism entered the West through the clergy, through the bishops, and therefore influenced the clergy, and that would explain why in the late 4th century the Church of the Western, the Western Church rather, the Latin Church, was ready to impose clerical celibacy on its members. The other argument is the argument from ritual purity. Now this was the argument I didn't want to defend, and therefore I had to find some way to criticize it, although my ideas have matured a bit on this topic as well. Simply put, the argument from ritual purity connects total continence to the observance of sexual abstinence by clerics on the day before the celebration of the Eucharist. In the ancient church, anybody who received communion, but of course especially the clergy who celebrated, would not have sexual intercourse with their wives or husbands before the day before. The question is, therefore, how often did they celebrate the Eucharist? The church calendar was developing at that time. You had the weekly cycle, the Sunday, every Sunday which was the resurrection. Then you had the annual cycle, Easter, Paschal Tide, and the gradual development of the Easter season and Lent as a preparation. On weekdays, the celebrations were restricted at first to saints' days. And saints' days tended to be local because each church had its catalogue of martyrs. And therefore they would celebrate on a weekday when there was an occasion to celebrate. Now it's true that some famous martyrs would spread beyond the confines of the local region. St. Lawrence, for example, was always very popular. And St. Augustine in Africa celebrates every August 10th, I think. Every August 10th, the feast of St. Lawrence, who died in Rome. Peter and Paul would be another. But most of the saints were local, and therefore the calendar would not be very crowded with feast days. It meant, therefore, there were many days in which Mass was not said, if it is true that they had to have an occasion for Mass, as seems to be the case. It meant, therefore, that a married clergyman wouldn't be called upon to celebrate Mass every day, and therefore there would be some times when he could have intercourse with his wife and have his family. You can see then where I'm going if you're following this at all. The claim is that Mass began to be celebrated every day late in the 4th century. There's that crucial period again. Well, you can see the poor priest. He's caught. If you can't have intercourse with your wife the day before you celebrate Mass, and they put Mass every day, well, that's it. You're forced almost automatically, automatically to be continent. It's no ideal, it's just a fact. It's too bad for you. So we know that they observed ritual purity of this sort, and if you can demonstrate that Mass became universally daily at that time, then that answers it. And there are vehement proponents of this view. A man called Roger Grisson is the most, at least he was the most famous when I was writing my thesis. Now there's certainly flaws in this argument. First of all, it's implausible, I think. For example, it would imply that a married priest, who for some reason or other was not saying Mass on a given day, or might be traveling or something, could legitimately have intercourse with his wife. It makes it so haphazard. That seems to me implausible. Also, it requires an abrupt and absolute appearance of daily Mass. All of a sudden, everywhere, everybody began saying Mass every day, even though they hadn't been doing it before. Well, if I had trouble justifying the spread of monasticism in 40 years, how can you justify the sudden appearance of daily Mass practically overnight? And then if you look at the historical evidence, you discover that in fact, daily Mass was the exception, not the rule, at this period of church history. There's little evidence that there was daily Mass in Gaul, or France, we would say, even during the 6th century. In Rome, the only mention of daily Mass is by our friend Pope Siricius, the one who sent that decretal to Spain. A witness called into question, perhaps, by the fact that there was no daily celebration during the episcopates of his predecessor, Damasus, and one of his near successors, Innocent I, in the early 5th century. The first explicit reference to daily Mass in Rome, apart from Siricius that is found in the correspondence of Pope Gregory the Great around the year 600, and so on. So the evidence for daily Mass, therefore, is not at all strong. And that would mean, therefore, that you would have this haphazard imposition of clerical continence, not universal. It can't be a ritual argument. That's my point. And finally, if you look at the actual decrees, what the popes said and what the councils said, it's true, they honor the principle of ritual purity, but they do it in a way that broadens its scope. It's not mechanical, as I say. By the principle of ritual purity, a period of continence is demanded before participation in worship. It does not extend itself to absolute continence very easily. The element of ritual purity seems not to have been primary in the papal documents, since the ban on marital intercourse was absolute, even where it would not have offended ritual purities, where there was no daily ministry. Nor does the use of ritual purity show a direct influence from paganism, as many people suggest. It's true there are references to pagan priests in the papal decretals, but they're there merely to indicate that continence was honored in unlikely settings, that element of competition again. If they can do it, why can't we? The enormous difference between occasional, even fairly regular, cultic abstinence and absolute continence draws into question an exclusively ritual motive for the decretals of Siricius, and their analysis bears this opinion out. Siricius' defense of asceticism, which we find in the letters as well, I was happy to note, and the virginity of Mary, his close contact with Ambrose, and the exercise of his episcopal and papal responsibilities towards ascetics also highlight the importance of the ascetical ideal of this legislation. Nevertheless, the ritual argument has remained very popular. And when I was doing my research, I constructed a genealogical tree. It all seemed to go back to a man called Eugen Fehler in 1910. He wrote a book called Die kultische Keuschheit in Altertum, Ritual Purity in Antiquity. It was mainly concerned with pagans. There's very little on the church. But those ideas were picked up and used in the argument about clerical celibacy in the 4th century that I've described by Böhmer and Schillebeeckx and Grisson and Sloyan and other people. It still remains very popular. So you can see then what I've said so far. You have Bickel claiming it's apostolic, Funk claiming it isn't. Funk wins the day. Therefore, the scholars have to come up with some reason for imposing clerical celibacy universally at the end of the 4th century. Some of them, like me, went to monasticism. Others went to ritual purity. Now, since that, there's been a sort of revolution take place. Excuse me. There are 2 books on the table there that I'm going to refer to now. The first is by a German diocesan priest called Stephan Haidt, and the title of the book in German is Zölibat der frühen Kirche, die Anfänge einer Enthaltsamkeitspflicht für Kleriker in Ost und West. And that mouthful means celibacy in the early church. No. Haidt utilized and extended the evidence that was presented by Christian Kokini, whose book is Origine apostolique du célibat sacerdotal, which means the apostolic origins of priestly celibacy. That book is over there too. And a book that isn't there by a priest of the Eastern Rite, a Ukrainian priest called Roman Choli, Clerical Celibacy in East and West. Now, all of these books, current books, latest thing, defend Bickel's position and attack Funk. And it resolves all the difficulties that I've mentioned in passing. So they claim that the celibacy of the clergy is an apostolic ordinance. It goes right back. Now, Haidt is the most recent one, and although he acknowledges his debt to Kokini and Choli, I'm going to follow him because, well, it's the most recent one, and therefore he not only honors but extends the arguments that we've seen. So let's look therefore, we'll work back to St. Paul. We'll look at the period between 100 AD and 400. What about all those married priests, bishops, and deacons, the fathers of families that we read about in the literature and councils during the first few centuries of the Christian era? Well, rather surprisingly, to us at least, there is no hard evidence to disprove that clerical continence was apostolic. That is to say, there is no instance in the Church of marriage after ordination or of children conceived after ordination. I don't mean that there were no children conceived after ordination. The clergy haven't always been virtuous, as we know to our dismay, but there shouldn't have been. It wasn't allowed. Now, of course, the negative argument, the argument from silence, is the weakest of all arguments. And the evidence, admittedly, one way or the other, is sparse. But nevertheless, Haidt is very clever in his book. He turns the tables on those who have criticized his predecessors, that is, Coccini and Cioli. He turns the table on those critics, for he claims that they rely on the argument out of silence. Nothing is said. It's very hard to draw conclusions when nothing is said. And as I say, that's the accusation made back and forth. But Haidt notes that all of the admittedly few texts that refer to married clergy presume or support his thesis. There is no instance that we know of where a child was generated legitimately, that is, after ordination. In other words, it's the critics who will have to resort to the weakest of all arguments. They can't produce any evidence for their position. The fallback position of these critics is also effectively challenged by Haidt. In other words, the critics say, do you expect us to believe that there was a universal obligation to continence when there is no evidence for it and no sentiment in human nature that would allow it? What they accuse Haidt of doing is foisting 4th century attitudes, these monastic or ritual purity ideas, foisting 4th century attitudes on sexuality, foisting those on the primitive church. But Haidt repeatedly demonstrates that the real anachronism lies in his opponents reading 20th century ideas back into the early church. In fact, we know that continence in marriage was then honored even in paganism as an ideal, especially for older couples. And given the relatively mature age required for those to be ordained, there's nothing implausible about a requirement of continence. So each person accuses the other of foisting upon the early church ideas from a later era. Haidt says that modern people cannot recognize a different attitude towards marriage and sexuality from themselves. Too many explosive P's? Yes. In short, what we do know about the first 4th centuries of Christianity is compatible with Beckel's position, namely that celibacy, continence, is apostolic. The age of ordination was relatively advanced, so that any children referred to could have been born beforehand. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering about what happened to Paphnutius. Remember, he was the monk bishop who intervened at the Council of Nicaea and said, we don't want any new ideas about restricting the use of marriage among the clergy. Paphnutius urged before God that they ought not to enter the church by too stringent restrictions. For all men, said he, cannot bear the practice of rigid continence. That incident would seem to refute the statement I just made about no evidence. The fact is, however, that many scholars have called into question the historicity of the whole Paphnutius episode. There's nothing about it in the few documents we have from the Council of Nicaea. It's referred to 100 years later by an historian by the name of Socrates Scholasticus. So 100 years later, referring to an incident for which there is no earlier evidence implies or suggests that it could be a fabrication. And Haidt goes a step beyond Coccini, who argues ably in that direction, by pointing out that there is a reason for it appearing at the time it did in the history of Socrates. In other words, there's a schismatic group called the Novatianists, who allowed their clergy to beget children, and they wanted a precedent for it. So the evidence, therefore, or the argument can be made that the whole episode of Paphnutius is false, a fabrication. And there is another one of those arguments out of silence that are so weak, but not altogether dismissible. Haidt notes the silence regarding the incident in the Eastern Church. Now, the Eastern Church does allow marriage to its priests. You would think, therefore, in doing so, they would like to refer to that episode of Paphnutius, who seems to support their view against the Catholic view. Okay. So one of the strongest arguments against the historicity of Paphnutius comes from the Council of Bishops that determined the current practice of the Greek Church. The council in Trullo, it was called. Trullo was a palace in Constantinople in the year 691. A bit late for our purposes, but it's relevant. Canon 13 stipulates that a married man who has been ordained to the diaconate or to the priesthood can exercise his marital rights, except, of course, for certain prescribed periods of ritual abstinence. What is conspicuous by his absence is any precedent for these regulations. There's nothing, for example, about Paphnutius or any other source, theological or conciliar, from the East. The only authoritative text advanced at this council that allows deacons and priests, but not bishops, to exercise their marital rights comes from, hold on to your hats, the Council of Carthage. That, as we saw earlier, enforced absolute continence in all married men after their ordination. So you must be wondering what sleight of hand would allow a canon to be made to support a position the opposite to what it says. In other words, the Council of Carthage says that all clergy must be absolutely continent. That was back in 390. In 691, when the Eastern Church is establishing its current discipline, that priests and deacons can use their marital rights within limits, they quote the Council of Carthage. But how could they quote something that says exactly the opposite of what they're imposing? Let me quote the Council of Carthage, then I'll give you the version that we find in the Council of Trullo. Here's Carthage. You heard it already. What the apostles taught and what antiquity itself observed, let us also endeavor to keep, namely, that the holy bishops and priests of God, as well as the Levites, that is the deacons, those who are in the service of the divine sacrament, observe perfect continence, so that they may observe in all simplicity what they are they may obtain in all simplicity what they are asking from God. And here's the version we find in the Greek canon law. We know that the fathers gathered at Carthage, the fathers are the bishops. We know that the fathers gathered at Carthage have decided that subdeacons who touch the holy mysteries and deacons and also priests must abstain from their wives during the periods that are particularly assigned to them. So they dropped bishops altogether and they changed the absolute continence into a periodic continence. So I think we may follow therefore the scholars who dismiss Paphnutius from the debate, and with him the only solid evidence against the Beckel thesis. Although the Pauline texts remain, don't they? What about those texts from 1 Timothy that demonstrate that bishops and deacons, and by implication priests or presbyters, were married and had children? Haidt and his fellow apologists focus on the stipulation that the bishop or the deacon must be the husband of one wife. That for them is the main entry into justifying their statement that celibacy is apostolic. What does it mean to say that a man must be the husband of one wife? Well, I suppose it could mean that he can't be a bigamist or a polygamist. That's hardly likely here. I presume it means, therefore, that he could not remarry after the death of his wife, or maybe after a divorce, equally unlikely to polygamy. So let's say then it means he could not remarry after the death of his wife. As St. Paul elsewhere noted, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, a second marriage exhibits a certain lack of control. Here's what he says: "To the unmarried and widows, I say that it is well for them to remain single, as I do. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion." The idea is, therefore, that anyone in a second marriage has demonstrated an inability to persevere in continence. He would be, by that very fact, ineligible for ordination if it required such continence. And so we move to the third element of St. Paul's business about being the husband of one wife. A bishop or deacon would have been in a continent marriage with his wife, since if she died, there would be no point in entering into another marriage because, as continent, it would not produce any children. So the absolute stipulation which was pushed to the breaking point, the bishop's wife, for example, couldn't be a widow and so on. The absolute stipulation could be based on the fact that all the clergy were required to be continent. And the reason they couldn't marry after the death of their wife was that they couldn't have children. And therefore, why would anyone want to marry? So you can see that number 3 implies that no cleric, whether a widow or a celibate, whether a widower, I should have said, or a celibate, would be allowed to marry after ordination. Now, it is an historical fact that the ban on marriage after ordination has been universally observed throughout the history of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. The absolute ban suggests that the Council of maybe that's the point I won't bother going into. There is a counter-evidence, but it's not too relevant for our purposes. So that's the basic argument, going back to St. Paul. The husband of one wife means that they cannot remarry when their wife dies, if they're already married. And the implication seems to be that they can't use their marital rights. This is still the regulation in the Eastern Church, even though they allow their married priests and deacons to exercise their marital rights. It produces certain difficulties that those opposed to clerical celibacy in the Latin Church might consider. A friend of mine spent a year in a Romanian seminary. Romania, of course, is Orthodox. And he told me that the fourth-year seminarians who aren't married are desperate to get a wife, because once you're ordained, you can't get married. They roam the streets looking for anybody who will marry them. They finally find some city girl, sophisticated at least by Romanian standards, and they're pointed to the sticks somewhere, and they bring the city girl out, who is very unhappy living among the sheep and the goats. So it doesn't solve all the problems. In any case, that is their basic argument. And other biblical texts have been advanced, such as Luke 14:26. If anyone comes after me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. In Matthew, the same text appears without the word wife. I'm not saying that Kokini and Choli and height have settled the matter. What I'm trying to point out is that I would say the burden of proof rests in the opposite camp at the present time. They seem to have demonstrated, as well as can be expected, that right from the beginning of Christianity, the demand of celibacy was imposed upon those in leadership positions in the Christian church, going back to the apostles themselves, as the text from Luke might indicate. So let me draw a couple of conclusions, because after all, I haven't said anything about the reason for celibacy. If we can accept the position of these modern scholars, Kokini, Haidt, and Choli, we would have to conclude that the Orthodox Church departed from the primitive discipline in 691 by allowing married priests and deacons to exercise their marital rights. So far from honoring an ancient tradition, they are the ones who introduced the novelty. I might note as well that Orthodoxy does have a law of celibacy for bishops. And that is why, by and large, the bishops are recruited from the monastery. They can't be married, they must be celibate. I just rang up the Orthodox seminary yesterday to find out the current discipline. And not all the priests are required to be married, although at certain times they were. They're not all required to be married. So it's possible that a celibate priest could become a bishop. He also told me that it's allowed for a married priest, with the consent of his wife, to go to a monastery, if she goes to a convent, and then from that monastery he could be ordained a bishop. So they do have a law of celibacy for bishops. They draw the line at a different place from us. However, we'd have to say that the Catholic Church has also departed from the primitive discipline quite recently by allowing married deacons to exercise their marital rights. And also, a few convert clergymen have been allowed to become Catholic priests and yet continue in the married state, fully in the married state. Furthermore, the Catholic Church has within its fold, among those who recognize the Bishop of Rome as the center of unity, Christians from the Eastern churches, Ukrainians, for example, some Greeks. Virtually every Eastern church or national church has some members in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And many of them are married priests. It's allowed. So the discipline of the early church, if we have described it correctly, has not continued completely. That's the first conclusion. It raises interesting theological questions for the likes of us, I think. The second one is a defense of clerical celibacy should invoke ritual purity and asceticism. Two arguments that have very little appeal for modern people. But the notion of ritual purity is connected to the sacramental role of the priest, and the asceticism or the monasticism, that element is connected to his special vocation to holiness, which, like the monk, has certain elements that put him in immediate contact with the heavenly reality. You see, the essence of monasticism, of religious life, is the anticipation of heaven. That's what the early monks and nuns tried to do. When they went to the monastery, they had a symbolic death, and when they came to, they were living in heaven where the praise of God was their sole occupation. Now, the priest has a similar access to heaven in his sacramental ministry, where as another Christ, he goes to heaven, finds treasures there that he can share with the people in the sacramental ministry. So both of them, I think, have a heavenly dimension. And since Jesus said, in heaven, men are neither married nor given in marriage, but are like the angels, the angelic life became a symbol for the monastic life and not implausibly also for the clerical life. I would also be willing to defend clerical celibacy on the argument of pragmatism or practicality. The priesthood is a way of life. It should be a full-time occupation. And therefore, the idea that a priest can have a family and still exercise his ministry to the full is, shall we say, at least difficult. It may not be a theoretical difficulty, but it's a practical difficulty. Catholics tend to expect their priests to be available. In my class I was teaching The Genius of Christianity by Chateaubriand. And he talks about the importance of celibacy in these terms, the terms of practicality. So I'd like to close by simply quoting what Chateaubriand has to say on the matter. It's rather strong, but here's what he says. When the number of Christians increased and morality was weakened with the diffusion of mankind, how could the priest devote himself at the same time to his family and to the church? How could he have continued chaste with a spouse who had ceased to be so? Those city girls in the mountains of Romania. If our opponents advance the practice of Protestant countries, we will observe that it has been necessary in those countries to abolish a great portion of the external worship of religion, that a Protestant minister appears in the church scarcely 2 or 3 times a week, that almost all spiritual relations have ceased between him and his flock, and very often he is a mere man of the world. This is before the age of ecumenism. Finally, in those countries where the marriage of the clergy is allowed, the confession of sin, which is the most admirable of moral institutions, has been and must necessarily have been discontinued. And the priest at the Orthodox cathedral said that confession in the Orthodox Church is very different from confession in the Western Church. It tends to be much more what we would call a general confession. In any case, it cannot be supposed, Chateaubriand says, that the Christian would confide the secrets of his heart to a man who has already made a woman the depository of his own. In other words, in the bedchamber after the confessions, there's no telling what the wife can worm out of the husband. And he would with reason fear to make a confidant of him who has proved faithless to God and has repudiated the Creator to espouse the creature. Oh, thank you.
Father Callam will be happy to take a few questions if you have them.
I would just like to clarify something. If I hear you correctly, you actually changed your position on your own dissertation.
My position on what?
On your dissertation. I mean, you were supporting Funk, and now...
Yes. Yes, she asked me if I changed my mind. Yes, I changed my mind.
I mean, that's really something. I'm just really impressed with that.
Newman said to be perfect, to have changed, to grow, to be alive is to change, to have changed often is to be perfect, or something like that. So,
I thought, whoa.
you thought I never changed my mind about anything? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned late lights and wartime, I guess the traditions before Christ. If I understand correctly, even Orthodox Jews can be married. Am I correct?
Yes, of course.
If so, how is it that they now can be?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, and I don't think I understand it anyway.
All right, can you talk about the Jewish tradition of celibacy and how that changed with the New Testament and whatnot?
Well, the Jews don't have celibacy. In fact, you have to be married, and the rabbi has to, having children is everything. They did have periodic continence, however, when the priests, the ritual purity was very important in the Jewish religion. In fact, it's a fascinating topic. You know, the dietary laws, there are all sorts of things that made you ritually unclean. The dietary laws, burying a corpse, for example, touching a corpse, any bodily fluid, any emission of bodily fluid, the certain foods, war, hunting, sexual intercourse, the woman's period, the man's seminal discharge, all of the things made a person ritually impure. And it's got nothing at all to do with morality. I mean, burying the dead, for example, is an act of virtue, and yet it makes you ritually impure. So it's connected with the blood taboo. Claire, apparently you weren't at church. I gave a sermon on this about 2 months ago. So either you forgot it or I didn't. But it's all connected with the notion that blood is life. The Bible, the Jews say, blood is life. And for them, materialists as they were, the blood was like the soul. And it's everywhere. You know, you cut your ear, you cut your finger, blood comes out. So blood was life. And that's why the rabbi has to slaughter the meat, so the blood is drained into the soil and goes back to God. So I think that anything to do with blood was considered to put you out of the scope of society. We're in touch with God. And I'm not sure myself of how this works. But anyway, it seemed life was sacred, and blood was life, and therefore the blood put you aside. But I read one author that said, for the Jews, marital intercourse was polluting in the sense of a holy pollution, it's not dirty or evil. In fact, it's how children are born. And that they pointed out that the rabbis would wash their hands after reading Scripture, not before. The idea that you come in contact with the divine, there's a sort of contamination, a holy contamination. The example I used in that homily was someone coming back from outer space. They put them in a decontamination chamber because there's no telling what they can bring back from outside our sphere. And the same thing seems to happen with the Jewish notion of ritual purity. So I think there's something very deep and profound about ritual purity. And there's one place where it's kept alive in the Catholic Church that nobody ever thinks about. But when the vessels used in communion are rinsed out, we talk about them being purified. We purify the vessels from the sacred elements. And the little piece of cloth is called a purificator. That's an example. That's what we talk about ritual purity. So there's something really very profound, and that's why it seems to me that we would be well not simply to dismiss this as a primitive taboo or something of that sort, or looking upon sex as dirty. It's the opposite. It's connected with the power of God to create life. And all the bodily fluids that the mother's milk and all that stuff were all thought to be forms of blood. The male semen was thought to be a form of blood. So blood was the clue to it. Hunting, military, all of these things were somehow connected with it. And the food laws, that's another matter. And I don't know, I haven't read too widely on it, but the best instance I found of the dietary laws was sort of putting order in creation. Since there is a difference in the animals, the difference must be significant. Otherwise, God wouldn't have made different animals. And therefore, the animals that the Jews knew and used, like sheep and goats and so on, and cows were all clean. The animals they didn't know and use were somehow outside, and therefore they were considered unclean. But it's a complicated, subtle thing that I don't understand myself. Yes, Father Crooker?
On that question of husband of one wife, since it's also mentioned as a sort of criterion for choosing people for ordination, it seems that to have remarried after widowhood, even before ordination, was an obstacle.
Yes, it was.
And it wasn't because of the fact that they would be bound to continence. It's simply that well, you mentioned the other reason that it sort of implied a lack of discipline, whatever. But it was introduced as a not just that they couldn't remarry after ordination, but that they couldn't be ordained if they had remarried before.
Yeah, that's right. But if the idea that Haidt presents, if I represent him correctly, is that because they had to be continent after marriage, and a person who was married twice was not, before ordination, wouldn't be an apt person because he wouldn't be able to be continent. In fact, and they extended it to the wife as well, and she couldn't be, he couldn't marry a widow and then be ordained and so on. So they became very, very strict about this. But Haidt's feeling is that the simplest explanation for all of that is that the priests and bishops and deacons had to be continent. Yes, sir?
Could you comment on the contrast between the second chapter of Genesis and the clerical, or not the clerical, the celibacy set up in the church? In the second chapter, it would seem that when God made Adam and had a very, very intimate relationship with Adam, that Adam still required that he have a partner. And so God said it's not good for man to be alone. And even though he was in the Garden of Paradise and he had everything he needed to take care of himself, and then God created all the animals and so forth in front of him for a partner, and Adam wasn't at least bit interested. And then it came where God seemed to be frustrated, and he put him into a deep sleep. And when the two of them came out of the coma after being split apart, there was this joy and satisfaction and interest in each other, which is explained by bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That contrast is quite a thing. And it seems to be that the church is overriding what God himself established in the beginning. Could you comment on that?
Well, the teaching of the church is that, yes, you're quite right, celibacy is an unnatural state. And it's only characteristic of the new dispensation. And I think I would approach that question by, I don't know if everyone heard it or not. He's wondering, everyone hear it? Okay. I would approach it by saying that the coming of Christ opens for us the way to heaven, to a heavenly existence. The Jews, until fairly late in their career, had no belief in an afterlife. And therefore the blessings of God have to be realized in this life. And hence the blessings of God that you find throughout the Old Testament are a spouse, children to the fourth generation, wealth, prestige, flocks, so on. All the things that make human life pleasurable are the rewards of the virtuous. And as I say, they had no notion of an afterlife until fairly late in their career. Now with the coming of Christ, things are different. And we know that in Christ, in the resurrected Christ, we have access to an afterlife. And that one day, therefore, this world will pass away. And there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And in that world, Christ says, there will be no longer, we will be no longer limited to what you describe, the normal relationship of man and woman. And as a witness to that, Christ himself was unmarried, and as a witness to that, he expected the certain people to anticipate the heavenly existence. So clerical celibacy shouldn't make any sense at all if there isn't a heavenly life. Or monasticism shouldn't make any sense at all if there isn't a heavenly life, where people are neither married nor given in marriage, because it's all based on anticipating that sort of existence. And you'd have to see it as a man or a woman is passionately in love with the spouse of their choice. So some people are passionately in love with God and find God directly consuming, and therefore wish to be with him in the same way as a man would want to be with his wife or the wife with the husband. So yes, it doesn't make any sense unless there is an afterlife. And since we believe in that, we need people who are going to witness to that by following this way of life. But that's why I said that the vocation of the priest, like the monk and the nun, has to be a totality. You can't simply be a priest. You can't be celibate and do nothing else. It has to be centered on a life of prayer, a life of service, availability, a conviction of the heavenly life. You have to put your faith in the line. Okay. And that would be my answer to you. Yes?
Yeah, I have look at the idea of the future and thinking of the church in relation to celibacy, and the fact that with declining members going to the priesthood, and the idea that it would be better to have priests who can celebrate the Eucharist and continue that instead of just requiring that they're married. In other words, you're going to have fewer priests.
You mean, so if you ordain or married men, you could solve the, or help solve the crisis in vocations?
Well,
is that the idea?
To be done in the future, because you're not going to have as many priests.
And you're saying ordain married men? Is that what you're saying? If you ordain married men, you would help solve that crisis in vocations? Is that the point?
It's something that you have to think about.
Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to understand your question.
That it's going to be better to have married men who can still celebrate the Eucharist and be priests than to not have it at all.
Yeah, so if you ordain married men, you would solve the vocational crisis, or help solve it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say to that, no. No, no. Let me explain myself. I think that the crisis in vocation is a spiritual crisis, not a practical crisis. That in the old days, there were lots of priests. My cousin, for example, there were 3 boys in the family, they all became priests, and so on. So, for some reason, I don't know, everyone has a reason, an account to account for it, but there are not as many vocations as there used to be. And I think, as I say, I think it's a spiritual crisis for the church. And I don't think you solve a spiritual crisis by sort of a patch-up job. If it's a spiritual crisis, then the solution is going to call for a conversion. And it may be the fault of the current crop of priests or bishops, the scandals, maybe we're still recovering from the hippie movement. I don't know what it is. But I don't think that we should try to outfox God. If celibacy is as important as I think it is, then I think we should have the courage of our convictions and trust to God's providence. No, that doesn't answer your question, but that's what I would say. Any questions over here? Yeah.
Does tradition or any of the authors you spoke of address St. Peter and what happened to his wife?
Well, the idea is that the apostles would have been the first to follow the continent way. And remember that quotation from St. Luke. So he would give up his wife, at least as a sexual companion. The New Testament seems to require that. There's another element of celibacy that you find actually in the Old Testament. Jeremiah the prophet was celibate because it was in a time of crisis. The city was about to be destroyed, the people sent into exile, and to witness the disruption of society and the turmoil, he didn't marry. The Lord told him not to marry. So it was a witness, therefore, to a time of crisis. And when the Lord appeared and proclaim the gospel, it's also a turning point. That's what crisis means, a moment of crisis. And therefore, at such a time, people put aside the normal way of life. I mean, think of Allison, the tropical storm. Everything altered during that time because there was a crisis. We couldn't go to work. We did all sorts of things. And so one of the elements of celibacy, I think, is the idea that when Christ comes, things are different. There is a call for commitment, absolute a way of life, surrendering everything in order to make the gospel message known. There's a note almost of desperation when you read the New Testament. And in such circumstances, the wonderful privilege of having a family seems to be denied to the apostles. So, in elements of that sort. Yes, sir?
Other than the reference to Jesus hiring St. Peter's mother-in-law, is there any reference or in any writings to the wives of the apostles?
No, but since every Jewish male, virtually every Jewish male was married, we can presume that they would have been married. But you know, there isn't any other. But the supposition is that they would be. In fact, there are many even people who think that St. Paul was married, despite the fact that he says he wasn't. But they say, well, he was just kidding because he had to be married if he was a Jew. So the supposition is that they would all have been married. Yes?
If the Pope wanted to, could he change and say the priest could get married, or is that something in sacred tradition that just can't be changed?
Well, he would be in a lot of hot water if he said priests could get married. Do you see the difference between a priest marrying and ordaining a married man? And for priests to marry would absolutely break with a tradition that is simply intact right down the centuries, despite that council that I didn't tell you about. Also, it would absolutely ruin any possibility of union with the Orthodox churches, which, as you know, honor tradition more or less, unless it's at the Council of Trullo in 691. But other than that, they're very keen on tradition. And, but of course, when you think of it, this is the argument of Haidt, that not being allowed to marry after ordination only really makes sense if there's a continent clergy. Because if marriage, as this gentleman pointed out, is an absolute good that everybody wants, and if the Orthodox Church allows married men to be ordained, and the wife dies, why in the world couldn't he marry? It doesn't. There's an inexplicable element there. But nevertheless, they're very keen on that. So I don't know what the Pope can and can't do. I'm not going to say. But I would be surprised if he broke that regulation. For those reasons. Well, thank you very much.
We'd like to thank Father Callam for a very rich presentation this evening. We'd like to remind you that, as Father mentioned, we're here this evening. And likewise, if he would like to sign up for further lectures, there are sign-up sheets to my right. Next week, Sister Paula Jean will be addressing us in reference to the priesthood of all the laity. It will be the 6th and final of our series, so we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Thank you so much for being here this evening.